Greetings, urban farmers, gardeners, and healthy food visionaries. Farmer Greg here, and welcome to the 469th episode of the Urban Farm Podcast, where every day we work together to educate and inspire you to become part of your food revolution. Summer is upon us here in Phoenix, and it's hot. With more people getting skin cancer these days, I'm not willing to take chances with the sun anymore. Before I introduce today's podcast guest, I want to share with you how I stay cool and comfortable working in the summer heat. My number one strategy is wearing lightweight, breezy, sun-protective clothing, like cool, moisture-wicking shirts and hats that shade my head, ears, and the back of my neck. I've partnered with Gemplers.com to handpick my personal favorite sun protective wear, and you can see them at Gemplers.com/urban farm. That's Gemplers, GEMPLERS.com/urban farm. When you use the code UrbanFarm01, you get 20% off your first order. Heidi and I use these essential items on this list every day on the Urban Farm. Check them out and stay cool this summer. Today on our podcast, we have someone who is creating resilience in an urban community. We're talking with Francey Slater about urban ag and food justice. Francey is the co-founder and executive director of Mill City Grows in Lowell, Massachusetts. Her experience creating garden-based education programming spans 2 decades, several continents, and youth through adult learners. Mill City Grows is an organization that fosters food justice by improving physical health, economic independence, and environmental sustainability in Lowell through increased access to land, locally grown food, and education. Prior to founding Mill City Growers, she was the education director for City Sprouts, worked as a member of the Urban Nutrition Initiative in Philadelphia, helped to restore agricultural efforts in a village school in Bangalore, India, and provided education for farmers, gardeners, and youth in Jotopec, Mexico. Welcome to the show today, Francey. Are you ready to rock?
I am, Greg. Let's dig in.
Excellent. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at today?
Sure. And it's an interesting path because for a lot of folks who end up surrounded by, food and farming and food production, that's kind of where they come from a rural experience or a farm-based experience. But I was a city kid. I grew up in the heart of Manhattan in New York City and never really had any, growing experience, much to speak of. We had little pots on our patio, and we would grow strawberries or try to grow watermelons. But that was kind of the extent of my childhood experience growing food. And it wasn't until I went off to college, again in the city. I went to school in Philadelphia, where I started to really become interested in food and where food was coming from the farms and gardens. And it was through kind of a backwards path. I think, I went into school really concerned about health and well-being, and this was kind of at the peak of the obesity epidemic when we were really starting to see these alarming trends of obesity among Americans and especially among children, and really kind of trying to figure out why is this happening, where is this coming from, and what can we do about it. And that really led me to the kitchen and kind of learning how to cook and learning how to see, how we can prepare foods that are supporting wellness instead of causing disease and illness. But then my time in the kitchen really led me back out to the garden because I became so curious about where food was coming from before it arrived in the refrigerator or in the pantry. And so my journey has been kind of a backward stepping to the land that in my lifetime I never really was on the land, but I find myself more and more connected and rooted as I get older. And I still live in an urban community here in Lowell, and yet knowing that even the most hardcore urbanites and city dwellers have a lot to benefit from and a lot to learn from being connected with the land and with nature and with food that's grown locally and with care and in sustainable practices.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been an amazing time to be doing this. I have to say, I think we've kind of hit a moment in our history,
yes, we have.
in this culture where people are really waking up to, to some of the things that our grandparents and great-grandparents and our ancestors knew through and through, but we've kind of forgotten them. And thankfully, we're coming back to that knowledge and that wisdom and that awareness, and it's just a wonderful time to be doing this kind of work in urban agriculture and community building and health building.
Amen to that. So you said something really interesting. You grew up in the city, and you discovered this later in life. I grew up in the city, right in the middle of Phoenix, and right now we have over 6 million people in here, in the valley. And so there's a correlation between your life and my life, where we planted ourselves in the city and planted in the city.
And I think there's so many people like that who, maybe they came from a more rural experience as kids, and we know the data shows that our population is driving more and suburban, population densities. And so we know that a lot of people have that experience of either growing up in the city and remaining, or, ending up in the city, but wanting to, again, get back to or connect with for the first time that land experience, and that having those hands in the dirt and everything good that comes from that.
Well, an experience actually growing your own food and eating it, which is an amazing process.
It is. It's such a gratifying process.
You also mentioned our SAD diet in this country. I'm using the acronym there, Standard American Diet. What did you find in your travels? What did you find as how that was connected to the obesity epidemic?
Yeah, it's super interesting, kind of stepping away from kind of our culture and kind of the daily status quo that you kind of become blind to it when you're immersed in it. When it's the only thing you see, you don't really notice at all. But I did have a chance in college, actually. Before any of my other experiences, I studied for a semester in Italy, and I think that was really my aha moment when I came back from spending 6 months in Italy, where food is the central part of every day. People are shopping at the market daily, fresh produce from farmers, incredible different, meats and cheeses and fish and produce and nuts and just, an amazing array every day is being brought into the cities from the surrounding countryside. People go home and cook lunch. They eat dinner together. The food is, and sharing food is a central part of daily life and therefore of the culture. And then coming back to the United States, it was just so much culture shock of, wow, we have so little regard for our food here. We eat and run. We're constantly on the go. We have convenience as our highest value at the detriment of quality and experience and obviously of health too, because we now are seeing more and more research confirming what seems to me pretty obvious, that highly processed foods are really bad for us, and that people who rely on a diet of highly processed foods are going to end up sick. And that, to me, coming back into our culture and seeing that so blatantly was really kind of what shook me to really continue to study and to experience, how are people kind of immersed in food culture, and how does that inform the decisions they make, and how can we shift our food culture in this country to be one that's more healthful and more reflective of what people's desires are? Because nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to eat crappy food and feel bad and get sick.
Right.
Right? Nobody wants that. And yet that's the reality for way too many people. And so, understanding what all the factors are at play that make that reality so prevalent has been kind of the passion of my career thus far, is really seeing, if it's about access, how can we change access? If it's about education, how can we change education? If it's about economics, how can we change economics? But really kind of unpacking all those things. And food is an incredible element of our lives because it's so present. We rely on it multiple times a day if we're lucky to actually be able to eat food that we need to sustain our bodies and our minds and ourselves and our communities. But it's also, so it's a very universal thing in that sense, but it's also a very personal thing, right? That everybody has their own preferences, everybody has their own memories and family histories and personal histories and, preferences and aversions and, all the emotion that's tied up with food of, your grandmother's home-cooked, apple pie or whatever that is that kind of holds that special place in your heart. And so it's this intersection of all these things. And when we think about the food system as, this process through which food is grown and transported and processed in many cases and ultimately ends up on our plates and in our bodies, that system involves so many other aspects and systems of our world. It's economics, it's the environment, it's culture, and it's geography, and it's so much goes into the production of our food and how it actually travels, physically to end up on our plates. That, to me, it's just such a fascinating way to understand the world, is by kind of tracking, how we eat and why things end up the way they do. I just read a global study that is now attributing the most deaths in the world, premature deaths, to poor diet. And really tying back, all of these diseases, all of these conditions, whether it's diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, certain types of cancer, that all rolled up, that is the leading cause of death, that it's linked to poor diet. And to me, that's a problem that we can solve and that we should be solving, because it's a problem that's been created and it can be undone.
Right. Well, and that's really your whole segue into the food justice movement.
Absolutely. And I think that, my experience, living in a city as a child, and then, living and studying in Philadelphia, again in a city, and traveling in cities around the world, and kind of, that's my lens. And I know that there's problems in the rural communities as well, but from the perspective of an urban dweller, just recognizing that the way that we access food here is often determined by a whole array of decisions that are made by people outside of our communities. And that, what has been called, food choice or food preference for so long, and that, there's been this assumption made that low-income communities have a preference for processed, unhealthy foods.
Right.
It's not actually a choice, and it's not a preference. It's the only option.
That automatically makes it their preference.
Right, because there's nothing else available. And, this idea of choice is really a fallacy. And so really kind of seeing that is an injustice that is being perpetrated to, millions of people in our country, that is leading to so much pain and suffering and so much economic detriment as well. When we look at the healthcare costs and the loss of productivity and the loss of life and the loss of, strong, resilient communities, it's really a huge problem. And again, I think that these are problems that have been created and that can be solved. And I think solving those problems in community, and especially in the communities that are most affected by it, is incredibly empowering work and is really exciting. And I think that there's so much that can be learned from communities who have been doing this work and struggling to create better futures and better lives for the residents.
What is food justice?
So food justice, in my mind, it really is the core belief that every single human being has the right to eat the food that they want to eat, and that they seek out that gives them strength and a sense of well-being in body, mind, and soul, regardless of where they live, regardless of what language they speak, regardless of how much money they have in their wallet, of any factor that might be kind of a determining factor, and that ends up being a determining factor when you look at food access data, that so much of what people are able to eat is determined by their zip code, by their race and ethnicity, by their income level. And so the idea of food justice is that food, healthy food, fresh food, culturally appropriate food is a right that all people should have access to. And
not just the fast food market on the corner.
Right, not just, here's what you get.
Yeah.
Figure it out.
How is urban agriculture going to impact food justice?
So I think urban agriculture is one of the most exciting ways that we can kind of take the next step towards a more just food system and society here, because, again, as I said, people are more and more living in urban settings, and as we know, urban settings are urban, meaning there's not a lot of land, so there's not a ton of space that people have to actually grow food. And so the movement around urban agriculture is to really carve out spaces within city landscapes landscapes for food production, for gardens, for urban farms, for rooftop installations. Even indoor agriculture is becoming a much bigger part of the sector. But I really think that part of the power of urban agriculture to me is the placement of food growing in the urban landscape. And it always gives me joy when I'll be out in a garden here in Lowell or at one of our urban farms to have an interaction with a neighbor who's walking by and saying, "What are you growing in there?"
Right.
Or, "Is that edible? Is that food?" Or, more and more, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen that crop since, I was a child growing up in my village," or "I used to grow that with my grandmother in her garden." And just reconnecting people who live in the cities to the origins of food and to their ability, even as city dwellers, to produce food and to produce their own food and to produce food for the people they live around and that they care about and that they are in community with. And, we do that here in Lowell through community gardens and school gardens and urban farms. And we also do it through opportunities for people to really learn about how to grow food, how to cook food, how to share food, because again, it's kind of this universal element in all of our lives and this hyper-personal element, and we can kind of use that as a tool to build a strong community and to bring people together. I don't know if it's your experience, but I always know that if I'm going to invite people to a meeting and expect people to show up, I better have some food on the table to share.
You bet. Yep. And it
so
better not be really donuts.
Yeah, no donuts. We always try for some fresh veggies and something tasty and something that people may not be expecting too, just to keep it interesting.
Yeah.
But I think the idea of, coming together around food is something so ingrained in our DNA, in our, as a species. That's part of who we are, and how we got to be who we are is because we figured out how to grow food. And we also figured out that we needed each other as a community in order to grow food and to survive. And so those are the things kind of going back again to those deeply entrenched things that people may not even be aware of themselves until they start getting into it, until they put those first seeds in the ground and see them sprout, or until they bring that fresh bunch of collard greens home and turn them into a soup that they remember, this is who I am, this is part of me.
Nice. Mill City Grows. Tell me about that. You started it. You co-founded it with a partner. How did it come to be, and what is it?
Yeah, so Mill City Grows we're an 8-year-old nonprofit organization right here in Lowell, Massachusetts, and my partner Lydia Sisson and I are the co-founders. Lydia's background is in farming and commercial agriculture. She was a CSA farmer prior to starting Mill City Grows, and my background is in education, and so we were friends and roommates and, kind of living our lives, doing our own work. She was farming, I was teaching in Cambridge, doing school garden work, and we would come home at night and she'd bring home, all the fresh produce off the farm that wasn't getting distributed out to her customers and markets, and we would just cook together and preserve food and cook huge meals to put up and to share. And while we're cooking together, lo and behold, we start having these really interesting conversations, and the conversations always came back to what are we doing? We're leaving Lowell. We were both living in Lowell, but we were leaving Lowell to go to do our jobs, which were so much a part of our individual passions for food and for, educating people and bringing people together towards, healthy, fresh foods. And we kind of at one point just challenged each other, like, are we just going to keep talking about this, or are we going to do something? Because we've had a lot of these conversations, and maybe we should follow up. So that really was where it all began, was around the kitchen table. And I remember when I had first moved to Lowell, one of the first things that I had sought out was a community garden plot, because that was something that I love to do, is to grow food. And I couldn't find a plot that I could access in Lowell. There wasn't a community garden that was, open to the public to even sign up and get onto a wait list, as I had in other cities that I had lived in. So I ended up building a raised bed garden in the front yard. I tested the soil first, and, of course, it had lead contamination, so I brought in clean soil and put down a liner and built up a raised bed to grow my garden. But all the while recognized, like, not everybody can do that. Not everybody has, knows how to do it, is aware that there's contamination in the soil in the first place, has the, disposable income to go out and purchase these things in advance, to create and grow a garden. And so that was a really big motivator when we were first starting out, was really, how can we create opportunities for residents of this city to grow their own food in a safe way that's going to be successful. And Lowell is an incredible city. I don't know how much listeners will know about the city of Lowell, but it's the fourth largest city in Massachusetts, but it's also the home of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Wow. So it has a deep history with, lots of historical relevance. But since the days of the mills have, risen and fallen, the city has constantly rebuilt itself and remade itself, and it continues to be a really thriving, vibrant community. It's an incredibly diverse community. I can't keep up with the stats, but the last time I heard, in the public schools here in Lowell, over 55 languages are spoken.
Wow.
And so it's just a global village. It really is. And it's, over 100,000 people live here, and yet you feel like you're part of a town sometimes, because everybody knows each other and there's all these connections that are made. But it's also a big enough city where there's so much going on, and there's so many opportunities to really dive in and learn so much about your neighbors and about all the different people who live in this city and call it home. So part of what you can learn about, obviously, is food and food culture that people bring with them when they come to Lowell. And that was something that we both were well aware of, having spent time around the city, seeing gardens growing everywhere, even in buckets and pots, even right in the ground. People were growing food already, but again, it was this question of, are people aware of the legacy of the mills, of the post-industrial contamination, frankly, that, the history of this whole geography. So that was a big motivator for us to really kind of jump into it. And the first thing that we did is we put together a group of advisors, just volunteers from the community, people that we knew about who might be interested or care about this kind of thing. And we just started talking about it. We didn't really have a plan or a project per se. We had an idea and a vision and kind of a general, inspiration that, like, people in Lowell should be able to grow more food and eat fresher food. How can we do this? And we really started talking to anybody who would listen to us. And one of those people that we talked to was the city manager of the city at that time. And, he said, well, that's an interesting idea, and thank you for your time, and goodbye.
I was actually going to ask you how the city officials have responded to this.
Yeah, so, he gave us some time, which was, very generous of him. But then actually a few months later, we got a call from the city. And it wasn't from the city manager, but it was somebody that the city manager had passed on our information to, who said, listen, there's a neighborhood group in Lowell that wants to revitalize a park that's been pretty much abandoned and is just, blighted. They want to build a community garden. Can you guys help? And before we even thought about it, we said yes. Yes, we can. And so we started attending planning meetings and visioning sessions with the residents and with the Department of Planning and Development at the city. And lo and behold, the community garden program was born. And we then spent the next few months, it was over the winter of 2011 to 2012, building out a City of Lowell community garden program and planning for the first garden that would open as a part of this program. And so the whole time we were researching other models and reaching out to a lot of different groups and going back to, the coursework that we had both done through, there's a program in Boston called the Master Urban Gardener program that really centers on community gardens and kind of developing and supporting the social side as well as the technical side of growing in the city. But we really just kind of dived right in and went from, kind of vaguely having an idea to like being quote unquote community garden experts and making presentations and, writing policy and creating a program. One of the moments that will never, leave me in the best of ways is that first day that we opened the community garden. It's called Rotary Community Garden. We had worked with the Department of Public Works. They had helped us build the garden, putting together the raised beds and installing all of the fencing and the sheds. And we had worked with the city to design and build this 40-plot garden. And we had no idea how many people would show up. We kind of had this idea, all right, well, maybe we'll get 20 people, and then, those 20 plots will go to those families and individuals, and then the other 20 we can kind of just do as demonstration plots and, donate the food to local pantries and senior centers and, just kind of use that as a way to promote techniques. And so we had this plan, and then on opening day, I remember seeing just the people coming, just people coming out of their houses, around the corners, down the block, and really just kind of flooding into this garden. And within an hour, the plots were totally filled. We were at capacity. We were starting a waiting list, and people were so happy. People had brought seeds and plants that very day and started planting, and it was really just a very visual representation of this idea and this belief that we had that, this is something that people in this city are hungry for. And it was something that, to be honest, there had been a lot of pushback and a lot of naysayers in various camps who, the general message was, no, this isn't going to work. This neighborhood, they're not going to respect this. Nobody's is going to show up. The kids are going to trash it. It's never going to work. And so to see that showing on day one of people showing up and saying, yes, we're going to do this, that was just so much of a inspiration and motivation for Lydia and myself to follow this through and to make sure that, we were giving it every chance that we could to succeed.
Yeah.
And that whole first season, it was, and we were volunteers at this point. We were literally volunteering all of our time. We would get phone calls all days of the week, all hours of the day from gardeners, from neighbors, saying, oh, I've got a worm on my tomato plant. What do I do? Okay, I'll be right over. Or, oh, somebody left the hose running and it's spraying in the garden. Okay, I'll be right over. Or the kids have jumped the fence. They're playing hide and seek in the garden. Okay, I'll be right over. And so it was really just this amazing immersion in the community. We got to know the neighbors and the neighborhood so well. We were on first name basis with, all the kids and their parents. There's a skate park right next door, and we got to know the kids in the skate park. And just seeing how a garden can bring people together in a way that few other things can. Frankly, that park had been a basketball court, it had been a volleyball court, it had been a tot lot, it had been a vacant lot where, dogs were running and making messes and people were dumping trash. It had been so many things, and none of them had really stuck. But to see it as a garden, people really could tell this was an investment that their neighbors were making and the residents of the community were making. We had very little incident of vandalism that continues to this day. People are very protective of the garden.
Oh, I'm
Even if they don't have a plot, there's, such a sense of ownership and pride when a community garden goes into a neighborhood that we really do have an informal, we've never put it out there as neighborhood watch, but people are watching, people pay attention, and people will still call and say, oh, this happened. Luckily now we're paid and we have paid staff, and so we're able to meet those needs and meet those, concerns and issues as they come. But I think, seeing just the way that those spaces in cities can be filled with that productive use of land that really is so generative, it's so positive, it fills that space with so much productivity and hope. Just the act of planting seeds over and over again is such a hopeful act, and I think that really is evident for anybody who walks through the park or passes by or lives next door, and it's such a positive impact.
Yeah. Wow. I have to tell you, as you were sharing this story about your first day of opening, I was in tears. And
I was in tears that day too.
Yeah.
It was very moving, and it continues to make my heart fill with joy to remember that.
Yeah, and that is truly epic. Can you tell me what you've done on your farm today?
So in addition to our community gardens, we have 7 community gardens, we have 13 school gardens, and we have 3 urban farms. And those urban farms is where we grow, our staff and volunteers, we grow food to distribute across the community. And so we do that distribution through our mobile farmers markets. And just this year, just today, we're launching a farm share program. So we had our first farm share pickup at our greenhouse, our urban agriculture greenhouse, which is a partnership with UMass, University of Massachusetts at Lowell. And we had 40 people coming out. It was a rainy, kind of crummy day here in Massachusetts, but people were so excited. There was so much brightness in their faces and in their spirits as they were arriving to pick up their farm share. And these were these beautiful boxes filled with greens and herbs, snap peas, and all different kinds of fresh veggies. And people were so excited. And it's just a thrill to see how connected people can become instantly when they are a part of their food system. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the connection to the food or to the land where it was grown, but it's to the people who are growing it. It's to the people who are sharing it. All these people who are now part of our farm share, they're starting to get to know each other and seeing that they're all connected. And, oh, you're not going to be around next week. I'll pick yours up for you and deliver it. Or, can I help you carry that to the car? All those small interactions, they end up being very meaningful. And that happens, at the markets. That happens when people are working side by side, at the farms, in the gardens, across the community. And that's, to me, I don't want to say the unintended consequence, but it's like the bonus of urban agriculture is that it builds these social connections and it builds community in our cities, which it can be really hard to build community in cities. People are accustomed to being anonymous and, being isolated, and to kind of try and break that down can be challenging. But it happens amazingly quickly and naturally, I find, when food is involved. And so once again, we use food as the tool to bring people together, and then once they're together, that's when the magic really starts happening.
Nice. And you've got to have some interaction with kids coming through the farms.
Oh, sure. Yes.
Tell me about them.
Absolutely. So it's so much fun having kids out in the garden. I've got two little kids, and I love gardening with them. It's one of the biggest joys in my life is gardening with any children at all. But I think, when we go into the schools and we start a new garden, or we bring the kids out to their school garden to do a planting day or a harvest day, it's transformative, and it doesn't have to be a big thing, but you can see the kids, the wonder in their eyes, you can see the joy, giving them a shovel and a wheelbarrow and saying, we're going to dig this pile of dirt and put it into this garden bed so we can plant and grow our food. They work with such purpose. They're so focused. And I've heard feedback from teachers on multiple occasions that they've seen their students who have the hardest time in the classroom for whatever reason, but that indoor, kind of traditional learning environment is not a good fit for them. When they get out to the garden, they shine, they thrive, they feel purposeful, they feel motivated, they're leaders, and they're exhibiting these things that makes them succeed and they feel successful. And I've had principals tell me, you don't know how many of my kids come to school on the day they know that they're going to be gardening, because that's a reason for them to get to school, and that's a win. And if we can keep getting them out into the garden, then they're going to succeed. And just, these very simple things that children understand very easily and very obviously. There was a poem written by one student that she basically compared herself to a plant and to a seed that when you look at it, you think there's nothing much there. It's hard, it's dry, it looks dead, but, with love and care, it will sprout and grow and produce. And, just these things that I think we can take for granted as being so powerful and so impactful, not just, from a nutritional standpoint, but from a holistic social emotional standpoint that gardens can provide for children, especially kids growing up in an urban environment, who don't have a lot of opportunities to be out in nature and to feel that sense of relaxation of being part of something much bigger than yourself when kind of the pressure comes off of you and you realize that there's a lot more going on that is not dependent on just you. And then I think the nutritional aspect is also really exciting because we have kids who come into the garden the first and say, I don't like vegetables, I'm not going to eat that, that's gross, it grows in the dirt, that's gross. And then a few weeks later, they're eagerly harvesting and tasting, the kale and the sage and, pulling carrots out of the ground and just rubbing the dirt off, not even washing it and taking a bite. And so really seeing that kind of, that affinity that grows for kids who get a chance to spend the time out in the garden.
Wow. Well, you are doing amazing work. I just want to do a virtual high five and shout out to you. I'm just sitting over here shaking my head, doing, wow. My smile is sore because I'm smiling so wide. So thank you for the work that you do.
Well, thank you for giving me a chance to talk about it.
Yes, and sharing it as well. So thanks. So I'm going to shift on you, and I'd like for you to talk about a time you failed, how you overcame that failure, and what you learned from it.
I've failed a lot. I've tried a lot of different things that haven't worked, and I think ultimately a failure is only a failure if you don't learn from it and you don't actually take the lesson and go back and try again. One thing that comes to mind was a garden project that we were working on here that kind of got fast-tracked. The funding was lined up, everything was good, it was a perfect spot, everything was pointed to green light, and so we kind of just rushed forward with it. But what we didn't do was involve the community, and we just assumed that the community would be on board. And that really came back to bite us, because right as we were kind of picking up momentum about to install this garden, there was a huge backlash, and it turned into a really bad kind of PR situation where, community group was up in arms and they felt disrespected, and nobody had asked about, what the impact would be on the neighborhood for doing this, new expanded garden. And so that was kind of just like a moment of, checking our assumptions and saying, wait a second, we actually know how to do this. We actually know that our process involves, the first step of our process involves a visioning session and that open forum for residents, for neighbors, for the community to have a voice and to be able to speak to, what the impacts are going to be, what the benefits and detriments are going to be from a garden in their neighborhood. And we skipped that. We skipped that crucial piece. And so that really just was a reminder of how important it is, to bring people together, to really listen and to validate everybody's experience and perspective. Because at the end of the day, we went forward with the garden. We changed it a little bit. We made adjustments, but at the end of the day, everybody was very happy. They wanted to be heard. They wanted to be considered. Mm-hmm. They wanted to be part of the conversation and part of the process. And I think that's true in so many aspects of our work, both, here at Mill City Grows, but just in general in the world, that how important it is to stop, take some time to really listen to people and listen to, the voices that may not be, the ones front and center who are at the table making decisions, but everybody who's going to be impacted by those decisions, to hear that, because ultimately the result is going to be way better when you've engaged those voices and you've brought them into the conversation instead of thinking about it as an afterthought and saying, oh yeah, sorry, we didn't ask you about this, we're just going to go ahead and do it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that was one of the big successes from your first community garden, is you involved the neighborhood and then they come out in droves. Yeah, really important.
Yeah.
So what do you consider your biggest success?
I think my biggest success is being part of the process of building a community around a collective vision. And that collective vision that means different things to different people and may have different nuanced details to different people, but that people are all coming together around that and feeling connected to the vision itself and to each other. And I think in a day and age where there's so much division amongst us and so many ways that we can be marginalized and fractured as communities, to find ways to actually unite people and to bring a cohesive sense of community is really refreshing, and it's really important, I think, to all of our health and well-being. I think we always talk about health in terms of, biometrics and, blood pressure and all of these kind of physiological health characteristics, but I really do think that, the well-being of a person really is tied very strongly to being part of a community and the well-being of that community. And we've seen that research coming out of like the blue zones and all these different studies that really talk about, being connected socially can elongate and, increase the quality of your life. And I truly believe that. And so when I think about kind of what I'm most proud of and feel most inspired by in this journey of my life, I think it really is kind of tapping into something that people feel excited about and that they want to be a part of and that they're stepping up to be involved with as a community.
Nice. So what drives you?
I think it's all those things. I think it's, being part of something bigger than myself. I think that, both in the garden and, in the social setting, like being an individual can be nice sometimes, but I much prefer to be part of a bigger picture. And so whether it's, digging in my garden and squishing cucumber beetles off of my plants, in the morning before I head out to work, and kind of knowing that, there's this whole world humming all around me and I'm just one little piece of it, all the way to my professional role at Mill City Grows and being, really embedded in and part of this community here in Lowell and working, every day to broaden that community and bring more people into it. That's really what gets me out of bed in the morning.
Beautiful. So if you could recommend one book for our listeners, what would it be and why?
Oh, one book?
Only one? Right? Well, there you go. Let's start there.
Well, I think The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan, that was a transformative read for me. Just the way that he really kind of broke down the food system to really understand, all the ways that we're connected, whether it's social, economic, environmental, all the historical context of our food system. So that was like a seminal read for me. But I think on kind of a more social side of things, the story of the Harlem Children's Zone by Jeffrey Canada, it's called Whatever It Takes. That was another really, really powerful book because, it kind of follows that thread of, here's an idea, here's a community, here's what can happen when people come together and really, give breath and life to this idea and this vision. And, and it's fed not by one person, but by this, diffuse network of leaders and community members.
Did they make a movie out of that?
Oh, I don't know. That would be a fabulous movie. Yeah. If they have, I need to watch it.
What final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
I think my advice would be to just dig in, grow something, and share it. And whether that's a plant or a garden or a project, an idea, a meal, I think everything is so much more enjoyable when it's shared, and you can enjoy that together. So just dig in. Don't give up on an idea, even if it seems crazy or out of reach or impossible. But also share it and bring other people into it because it will only continue to grow that way.
Beautiful. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today, Francey.
Thank you for having me, Greg. This was fun.
You bet. How can our listeners get a hold of you?
So you can look us up. We're on the World Wide Web at millcitygrows.org. We are also on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And if you go to our website, you'll find all the links and all the contact information there. You can email me directly at francey@millcitygrows.org. And again, you can find that on the website.
Perfect. That's millcitygrows.org. You can also find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/millcitygrows. We are your urban farming resource. You can find us on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and everywhere podcasts are found. Also visit urbanfarm.org to find articles, webinars, courses, and more. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.